I left the Democratic Party because it's led by fanatical ideologues who don't believe in freedom. They don't believe in freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of religion.
In this video, you're going to see Tulsi Gabbard explain how and why left-wing parties hate freedom, especially freedom of religion. And if you stay to the end, you'll see me expose how left-wing parties use crises and tragedies and capitalize on them to push for more control. Let's dive in.
I left the Democratic Party because it's led by fanatical ideologues who don't believe in freedom. They don't believe in freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and the right of every one of us to express ourselves without fear of retribution or retaliation from those in power. They censor speech they don't like. Why and how? They say, we need to protect you from yourselves, and so we have to protect you from things that we call misinformation, disinformation, or hate speech, speech that they don't like. They undermine our civil liberties, working with powerful entities in the propaganda media and big tech. They're trying to get rid of our Second Amendment in every way possible, rejecting the very reason why our founders passed it right after the First Amendment, rejecting the reality that every one of us has a right to defend ourselves and our loved ones, and that we are the check on the abuse of power by an increasingly tyrannical government. And that is what we are facing today. They reject our Constitution that fundamentally recognizes that our freedom comes from God, no one else. I left the Democratic Party because its leaders reject this truth and are increasingly hostile towards people of faith and spirituality, actively seeking to undermine our religious freedom and the spiritual foundation of our country. They are targeting people of faith. You heard from the last speaker and others very real examples of this, how they are targeting especially Christians. They are targeting peaceful pro-life protesters. They are targeting those they deem as radical traditionalist Catholics. Thomas Jefferson said, God who gave us life gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God?
One of the scary things is how radical left-wing parties will use different crises to push for more control. You see in this over in the States when it comes to the abortion conversation. They'll use the most extreme scenarios in order to justify pushing forward their agenda. Well, the same thing happens over here in the UK, and if anything, I think it happens quite worse. And an example of this is the recent case with a young girl called Sara Shariff. Now, the Sara Shariff story is truly, truly tragic. And what makes it worse is that several months before this happened, her father actually withdrew her from school, and so she was technically homeschooled. Now, this has led to growing concerns over the lack of regulation for homeschooling in the UK, and there have been calls for greater restriction on homeschooling, greater checks, greater state intervention. But now this worries homeschooling parents like myself who don't want the government involved in how we teach and educate our kids. Now, you might be thinking, come on, Emmanuel, like after a case like this, how can you not want greater homeschooling restrictions? You know, don't you care about young people like these who are being abused and taken advantage of? Well, on the surface, that seems like it makes sense. But when you step back and analyze the situation from a fresh perspective, you realize that whole perspective falls down like a pack of cards. Because months before Sara Shariff was withdrawn from school and technically homeschooled, while she was still in school, her teachers noticed bruising all over her body. Her teachers also noticed that she'd started to wear a hijab in school to cover up those bruises. And yet those concerns were inadequately dealt with, not when she was homeschooled, but in school. You step back a little bit further and you realize that the local authority that she lived under did not fully deal with the safeguarding concerns raised about her dad. So even when she was in school and when she was under the care of the local authority, they failed to act on the safeguarding concerns that were raised. Then you step back even further and you realize that the courts gave her father full custody of Sara Shariff rather than giving her to her mother. So the courts also were involved. And then you step back even further and you realize, whoa, she was known to the local authorities from even before she was born because of abuse concerns with her older siblings. Her father was known to the local authorities to be an abuser from even before she was born. And then you step back further and you realize this man is only in the country because his student visa ran out, and then he had a sham marriage with a Polish woman so he could get the right to stay, left her, and then married another woman who then went on to partake in this disgusting case. So let me get this straight. Before she was homeschooled, she was failed by the school, she was failed by the local authority, she was failed by the courts, she was failed by our immigration policy, but you're telling me it's greater homeschooling restrictions that we need? And then you step back even further and you realize that there is zero evidence that there is a greater risk of abuse for children who are homeschooled compared to children in the state sector. 20% of adults in the UK were abused as children. Less than 1% of children in the UK are home educated. So that means the vast majority of children that suffer abuse in the UK go to school where there is full state regulation. And yet it's homeschooling that now needs a greater focus. And then you step back even further, guys. You peel the onion one more layer and you realize that the Labour government have been pushing for greater homeschooling regulation for a long time. Even before they came into power, they said that they wanted to have a register of all homeschooled children in the UK. And this has become even more of a priority for them because so many parents have taken their children out of schools following the COVID-19 pandemic because they were not happy with how schools dealt with things, and their children didn't want to go to those schools. They didn't want to go back to places where they were being bullied, where they were forced to learn in a way that didn't suit their style, where they didn't have the safety and protection of their parents, and instead were in these mass indoctrination centres. And so the Labour government have seen that, and rather than celebrating the fact that more parents are looking to take their children out of school, relieving pressure on the public sector, they see that as a problem to control. Because there is no better way to control a population for decades and decades and decades than by having a monopoly on the information that their children receive. Why do you think so many young people think the way they do about abortion, LGBTQ+, gender ideology, about God, about the Bible? Because they've been indoctrinated. And make no mistake about it, they'll start with a register for safeguarding, and then they'll start to look at curriculum for development and to make sure you're meeting your academic milestones. But then they'll start to be assessing what you're learning for bigotry and hatred, list goes on and on and on, till eventually you just can't educate your own children. You have to send them into school. I don't just see my responsibility as a dad to make sure my kids get an education from someone else or from somewhere else. I see my responsibility as a dad to ensure of the discipline and instruction of my children in the Lord. I don't want my kids to be educated in institutions that teach them sex education from as young as 7 years old, teaching them that boys can be girls and girls can be boys, teaching them that the world was not created by God, teaching them that Jesus is not the way, the truth, and the life, but is a religion amongst many. I don't want my children to grow up in that kind of system. I want my children to grow up to see God's good world through a biblical worldview. Now, salvation belongs to the Lord. I'm not trying to say that homeschooling is a surefire way to being saved, but I am saying that homeschooling gives you more time to teach them the ways of God. And faith comes through hearing the word of God. So I want my children to hear more and more and more. But I can see how people who do not believe in God, our Prime Minister is an open atheist. People who do not believe that you know how to run your life, and people who, as in the last video we saw, believe that because there is no God, they need to be God. I don't want those people involved in my children's education. And my wife, it's funny, my wife asked me when I heard about that story, the Sara Shariff story, what my thoughts. And my thoughts were, it's really tragic what happened to her, but I know that people are going to use this as a scapegoat to increase regulation on parenting, to increase regulation on children. The fact is, just because they'll use fake compassion to try and push forward their agenda, that doesn't mean that they will win, nor does it mean that I will stop. Because as Paul says in the letter to Galatians, I am not following the approval of man. I will continue raising my children in the fear of the Lord, whether a local authority that rejects God, likes it or not, whether they try and use fake compassion to justify it or not. And I encourage you to be shrewd and to be discerning so that you never allow the fake compassion of people who hate God to restrict your ability to worship God, to raise your family in the fear of the Lord, and to let your light shine so that people may give glory to your Father in heaven. So as you can imagine, touching on these kind of topics, there are certain things we might not be able to say on platforms like these. So if you want to go deeper and talk about some of the agendas that are at play that raise themselves up against the knowledge of Christ and how we as Christians can stand against these, then consider joining our locals community. You can join as a member for free, or you can become a supporter and support the ministry. I hope to see you there. Peace and blessings.